So this is amazing to have a room full of colleagues dedicated to art museums and education, and thank you all so much for being here. I'm Michelle Grohe. I'm the Esther Stiles Eastman Curator of Education at the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum, and I'm also, thank you. Big fans here, thank you. And I'm also the NAEA Museum Education Division Director. And so again, welcome. This is our 33rd annual pre-conference. We have over 300 of us here today, which is incredible. So I can't thank everyone enough for joining us here this morning. So we're going to do a couple of different welcomes and go over some logistics before we kick it off with a keynote. So I'd like to start by introducing you to Makiba McCreary, who's over here. And she, yep, good. We like to clap in art museum education, yep. So she is the Patty and Jonathan Kraft Chief of Learning and Community Engagement here at the Museum of Fine Arts. She is three months into her job here. We are two. I want it to be more because it feels like it's been more. But we're just thrilled to have her here in the community as a colleague. We've already had many powerful conversations about art museums, education, equity, and inclusion. And we are grateful to be here at the MFA, and I'm going to turn it over to her for a few minutes.
Good morning. This is not a part of my remarks, but I really should say that before I even started here at the MFA, before I maybe even met most of the people on my team, Michelle was my first sort of tea over at the Gardner, and she gave me some incredible knowledge and advice, and so I want to say thank you for that time. It really made a difference for me. Good morning, welcome. I am honored to welcome you to the museum, and for some of you to Boston. Founded in 1870, the Museum of Fine Arts stands on the historic homelands of the Massachusetts people, a site that has long served as a place of meeting and exchange amongst different nations. As Michelle shared, I'm the new Chief of Learning and Community Engagement, and I have the privilege of working with some incredibly talented individuals across a portfolio that includes our public programs, community engagement, and of course, education. Of particular focus for myself and my colleagues is a design for learning and community engagement that ensures we are supporting pathways into museum employment and explicitly for people who are traditionally marginalized out of these opportunities and remain underrepresented in each of our museums. Our strategic plan for 2020 says that we will celebrate artists across time. We will honor all visitors. We will invite many voices. I joined the MFA so that I could contribute to this promise. We are all committed to ensuring our public institutions are indeed extending a bold invitation, a warm welcome, and to offer deep engagement. You, as museum educators, have the honor of using education as a vehicle to ensure the public gains full access to the beautifully powerful stories, narratives, and representation of community within your institutions. This is difficult work in any industry, and perhaps even more so in places that are built upon such privilege. Privilege can often create exclusion. This is hard work. You also have a privilege here today that I would like to remind you to take full advantage of. This is your time to disconnect from your daily tasks, responsibilities, and assignments. I'm not saying don't check email or texts. I would not be able to do that. But I am reminding you that it's not often that we find ourselves in a space with allies and believers who we can learn, teach, and share with for a concentrated period of time. Your work is powerful, and together we have a promise to fulfill. I am so very excited to be in this with all of you. Before I turn it over to our organizers, I will leave you with a quote from Audre Lorde. "When I dare to be powerful, to use my strength in service of my vision, then it becomes less and less important whether I am afraid." Thank you.
Thank you, Makiba. And thank you for having us here at the Museum of Fine Arts. It is really exciting to start the day here. On behalf of our Boston hosts and members of the NAEA Museum Education Division Development Committee, welcome to the 33rd Annual Museum Education Division Pre-Conference, Ways of Knowing an Art Museum Education. My name is Jaclyn Chevalier, and I have the pleasure of being the NAEA Museum Education Division Director-elect and the head of interpretation and participatory experiences at the Minneapolis Institute of Art. And I'm really excited to be here today to see old friends, meet new ones, and learn from everybody. The incredible thing about this group is the amazing brain trust that we have in this room and throughout the day. So I'm sure you will gain so much from your conversations between sessions in addition to your sessions. So there are many organizations and individuals who made today happen, and the planning for the pre-conference begins in the spring with a site visit and initial brainstorming meeting to share ideas and tap into what's going on locally. And so individuals from all of these organizations and institutions joined us this spring to start that process. So if you would join me in applauding them. And I'm going to ask for an even bigger round of applause for a few key individuals and institutions, the Gardner and the MFA, for donating so much space. And we know when you waive a rental fee what that's like. So they've waived many a rental fee, which we are very appreciative of. And I want to especially recognize Sophia Walter here at the MFA. None of this would have been able to happen without Sophia and her incredible capability and great joy as she helps everybody. I would also like to take the opportunity to recognize and thank those museum educators who've served on the planning committee for the pre-conference and those who are facilitating reflection sessions, gallery conversations, afternoon breakout sessions, and hosting lunches. A lot of people say, congratulations on this day, and I keep saying it is not just one person, it is a whole host of people. So if you have served in any of those capacities, planning or presenting today, please stand so we can recognize you. Thank you so, so much. And now I'm going to turn things back to Michelle Grohe, Director of the Division.
Thank you. So, and keeping with the spirit, we're just going to clap all day long. So please give a big round of applause to Jaclyn, who really has done a lot of the organizing for the day. So for the past 2 years, we have created pre-conferences focusing on equity, diversity, inclusion, topics that have become increasingly important to our field and everyday work. Thank you again for spending the day with us as we continue this exploration, and thank you for coming to Boston. This is really exciting to have everyone here. I want to keep my talking points a little short, but I wanted to highlight a few things that are coming up within the division, as well as if you're attending the conference over the next 3 days. So the leadership of this division, which we call the Development Committee, has been working on 3 main priorities for the past 2 years: fostering community and ongoing learning through digital initiatives, including our Viewfinder online publication and social media work, advancing research through our first national IMLS-funded impact study, and opening up opportunities for leadership by making the process of participating in our division more transparent. And this also goes hand in hand with the larger work by NAEA as an organization, who also has been working on equity, diversity, and inclusion as well. So in your folder, you will find a packet of about 5 pages thick of all the different museum education sessions that, that our division leadership has helped organize. We also highlighted the sessions that are under a new track in the conference under the heading Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion, so that you can get a sense of what those are like. Those are both also, you can search for sessions in the NAEA application or app on your phone as well. I also want to call out our annual awards ceremony, which takes place tomorrow afternoon at 4 p.m. It's a chance to celebrate the great work of peers across the country who are making important contributions to the field and to their communities, and we hope that you will join us then. Then on Friday, we have organized what we call a marathon series, which are 3 back-to-back sessions. This year, the theme we're focusing on advocacy. And also on Saturday, we have 2 sessions that reflect on the 3 years that we have offered the digital publication Viewfinder. Our most recent issue just dropped in the past week, so some of you might have read that on your way here. And this year, that editorial board of Viewfinder focused on the theme of intersectionality. So I hope that you will check it out. The current issue that just went live is focusing on language and the words that we use and the terms. And then lastly, I wanted to ask if you're on the development committee, if you could also stand up and wave. So as I mentioned, that is our leadership team that works really closely with Jaclyn and I as we map out both today as well as the different initiatives that I was just mentioning. I wanted just to name the different folks so that if you can put so you can look for them while you're here. So we have Wendy Ng, Michelle Harrell, Melissa Tanner, and Emily Jennings. And then we also have, as I mentioned, Jaclyn, Mika Fay, Kylie Crook, Heinel Epley, and Kabir Singh. So they will be around. They're happy to answer questions about the division as well. And I have one more introduction, which is our new leader, our division director-elect, who will, so those of you that might be new to NAEA, there's a 4-year commitment when you are elected to be director of the division, 2 years as director-elect, and that person manages the pre-conference, which is what Jaclyn has been doing. I will rotate off the board on Sunday, and then we have a new leader, Jamie Thompson, who, I don't know where Jamie is. She's here. There she is. There's right there. Yep, so that's Jamie. So Jamie is our director, division elect, who will work with Jaclyn moving forward. But thank you again, and I'm going to turn it back to Jaclyn.
Got rotating remarks today. We're almost there. Okay, so Michelle already went over a few of just one of the main things in your folder. I want to point out a couple of other things because logistics are key today. So in your folder on the left side are social media half sheet, Viewfinder half sheet, and then that stapled packet of museum education and equity, diversity, and inclusion sessions. On the right side is your map. Your map is going to be very important today. Then behind that is the schedule. And then behind that, some meeting agreements and maps for lunch and to get over to the gardener for this evening. A few things to point out about your registration materials, your envelope that had your name tag and your letter in it. The envelope on the outside sticker has the locations where you should be going today for each section of the day. And your letter is specific to you. It has your assignments as well with the letters and numbers that are associated with our 3 different breakout sessions today. You will use your map a lot because we've got gallery numbers, etc. So we're here until 11 o'clock, and we've built in about 20 minutes between each thing so that you have time to get around a very massive museum. At 11, we'll break. I'm going to ask for us to pause and let the folks who are facilitating reflection sessions go first, and then we'll all follow after them so they can get to their locations. Folks who are facilitating will also have signs that they're going to hold, so you can look for that as well. The small group reflection is going to be in the galleries, so check your registration, and those are noted with a single letter. After small group reflection, we'll have lunch. Lunch is on your own, and if you did sign up for a casual conversation over lunch, that should be noted on your registration. If you have signed up for a casual conversation for lunch, please meet at the Fenway entrance where you entered the museum. Okay, I'll say that again. If you're signed up for a casual conversation for lunch, please meet at the Fenway entrance, which is where you entered the museum this morning. And folks will be there with their signs, and you can gather and head over. This is the thing that I'm most proud of today, is this website. I learned how to make a Google map and put a bunch of pins on it, and then make a bit.ly to it, so exciting. So if you go to that website, it is case sensitive. That will take you to a Google map that then has all the restaurant recommendations on it. So it's a quick walk across the Fenway, across the Fens, if I'm remembering my Boston geography correctly, to a handful of restaurants. We do ask that you try not to descend upon the MFA cafes because 300 of you all at once, think about your own museum cafe staff. You wouldn't want to do that to them. So just keep that in mind. Because we are in galleries most of the day, we do have access to gallery stools, and those you can pick up at the Scharf Visitor Center, Level 1, Shapiro Courtyard. I'm sorry that didn't make it into print in your materials anywhere, so I'll say that again. The Scharf Visitor Center, Level 1, Shapiro Courtyard is where you can grab a gallery stool. There's not enough for everybody, unfortunately, so family hold back if you can sit on the floor comfortably. So after lunch, please work to arrive at your breakout session at 2:30, so you can be ready to go at 2:30, if not a little bit before. There are 2 sessions that are happening at the Gardner. So please check that information carefully. Most everything is here at the MFA, but check your breakout session. There are 2 of them that are happening at the Gardner Museum, which is a 10-minute walk, if that. Gallery teaching rounds out the day, 4:50 to 6 p.m. And again, those are in the MFA galleries. Look for the double letters on your sheet. And again, MFA staff, guards, et cetera, are going to be around to help you find where you're going. And again, your map is your best friend. And then we will end the day at the Gardner with a reception from 6 to 8. The galleries will be open for us, the store will be open for us, and we'll get a nice little discount in the store. So thank you, Michelle, for arranging that. One thing I did fail to do, in addition to, I had to recreate this PowerPoint this morning because I forgot that. So I also forgot to put whether you had RSVP'd for the reception. So try and remember if you thought you had wanted to go to the reception or not. And if you're tired, go find somebody to have dinner with and enjoy a nice evening. But we do hope to see you. It'll be a lovely evening. And I think I'm ready to move on to, there's the rest of the day with breakout sessions, gallery teaching, and then the reception. And if you have not had enough, the MFA is open until 10 tonight. So you could come back. You could just have like a 8 a.m. to 10 p.m. all museum experience. Whew. You'd be a stronger person than I. All right. So I'm going to get into the groove of it. Also want to remind you that after this, we'll send you a survey for feedback. You know how we love feedback. And we do read it really carefully. We do take it into account as we plan. So keep an eye out for that in a couple weeks after you return home. And also be sure to pay attention to your stickers with our hashtags. So if you're tweeting about things, please hashtag NAEA MuseEd19 or NAEA 19 or I am Museum Ed. And our social media team is going to be tweeting throughout the day, so check them out. They are at NAEA MuseEd. So today we examine ways of knowing, epistemologies, how we know what we know. And even using the term epistemology isn't quite right because it's rooted in its own worldview, a word derived from the Greek. And today's English definition includes, quote, the theory of knowledge, especially with regard to its methods, validity, and scope. Epistemology is the investigation of what distinguishes justified belief from opinion, end quote. But who determines what is justified and valid? Who are these individuals? Let's consider that question again as we think about our museums and other institutions that share objects and knowledge. Who determines what is justified and valid? Who are those individuals? What are their backgrounds? What languages do they speak? What foods do they eat? What is their gender? When leading gallery tours, I often joke with visitors that what they had for breakfast influences how they see and understand an artwork. And it's not really a joke because every little thing about us as individuals contribute to our worldview. I really hope that today we can work to understand our own worldviews and that of others, and to understand others on their terms, not ours. To use empathy and time to reflect on how another individual or group understands the world around them, to consider how that view may be different from our own, and to treat it with respect and validity. And I'm really excited that we get to start our day with Jaclyn Roessel. Born and raised on the Navajo Nation, Jaclyn Roessel is an alumnus from Arizona State University and the inaugural recipient of the Arizona Humanities Rising Star Award in 2013, which is given to young professionals whose work elevates the importance of humanities in the community. She's been named one of Phoenix 100 creatives you should know. Roessel has worked in the museum field for over a decade, confirming her belief in the power of utilizing cultural learning as a tool to engage and build stronger Native communities. Roessel is the president of Grown Up Navajo, a company dedicated to sharing how Native American teachings and values are tools to help build greater cultural competency in society. Roessel most recently served as the director of Decolonizing initiatives at the San Diego Museum of Man. Through all her endeavors, Roessel aims to expand her work to further inspire Native people to use their traditional knowledge as a catalyst to create change in communities today. She lives with her husband and son in Santa Ana Pueblo in New Mexico. Please help me welcome Jaclyn.
Bene she Jaclyn Roessel and she tachi initially ki ani bashin to the koje dashe do bilagane dashnella shemato shae krina do Monty Roessel ya ado shemasana a Lillian Uintili look at your dos and the Canadena sha. Thank you so much for the opportunity to be here with you all this morning. And I just want to say, if nobody has told you yet today, you all look fabulous. You look fierce. You look so fly in your clean clothes and your nice hair. And I say that with all sincerity. You look beautiful today. Thank you so much for the warm welcome. And I love museum educators because I feel as though we're the flyest people sometimes in the museum. Because we know how to style ourselves and be practical, right? Right? So it's wonderful to be here with you all. And I am so happy to be here. We'll talk more about land acknowledgements, but in just the connections that I've made, and I know that there are variations recognizing the people who have gone before us, who've called this place home and have made and learned, the Wampanoag people who've learned from the lands here, who've communed with the waters. This is our family's first time here in these lands, and it is just a joy to be here in this rich place, and it's really just exciting, especially to be invited to talk about Indigenous ways of knowing and to think about the people whose presence has been here way before we all landed into this area via the airport, and all of the ways that we come to this place. And I will say that's my little VP of Grown Up Navajo. His name is Abram. And as Jaclyn and my husband Warren, as Jaclyn was talking, I was like, wow, that lady sounds like she has it really together. I was like, and for the first time in a while, I'm like, both my hair and my clothes are clean. So it feels really good. You moms and parents know the beauty of that kind of just succinctness. And so again, I want to, or I was brought up to say thank you and appreciation. We have a teaching called Jaclyn, and it is essentially to be in the practice of acknowledging and being grateful. That's it. For what? Everything. To be in our existence as appreciative beings is something that I was brought to know. I come from Navajo land in the Four Corners area, so far away from oceans. I was surrounded by red sandstones at the foot of a mesa that we say in English is called Black Mesa, but it really looks blue. And during different times, you can see the green of the pine trees and the white sand that shines through in the little openings. That's where I call home. I live with my husband and my son in my husband's land in Tamaya, which is near the Rio Grande River, which is surrounded by beautiful cottonwood trees that I'm just longing for to come back to life and be in bloom. And they now look kind of weathered and rust-colored, but they look incredible in the springtime, and my favorite time is fall. That's where I call home. So as we're gathering together today and we're thinking about Indigenous ways of knowing, well, what does that mean? And for those of you who don't work with Indigenous cultural belongings, there are Indigenous people that are in your communities, and I hope that often that this conversation begins to challenge you to think about who those communities are and ways to reach them. But also, I'm reminded of this. I would like to hope that she wasn't a museum educator. At AAM last year, there was a woman during Q&A in one of the sessions where we talked about decolonization, and she prefaced her question to our panel by saying, I understand that some museums exist on Indigenous lands. And I really had a hard time. I scoffed, and I was thankfully the mic wasn't hot, but I said, well, in my mind, we joked about it afterwards, and I said, well, unless your museum is suspended by hot air balloons hovering above the ground, then your museum most definitely is on Indigenous lands. The reality is were they unceded territory or not, right? And so I think that that's something to think about, and I challenge you to, as we begin this conversation, to kind of open your mind to the knowledge and think about ways, and really, again, want to say thank you to the facilitators who will be leading the reflection session afterwards. It was really exciting to get to work from such an intentional space, to be able to have those 2 time frames. We did video conferencing together so that I could, one, it helped me plan this talk so I wasn't coming here speaking to you off the cuff, but it also from the standpoint of being able to drive home some of the points that I wanted to make, and then work with you all in helping people see the connection points between us. As Jaclyn mentioned, I'm the president of Grown Up Navajo, and what's interesting is that Grown Up Navajo is now, it's an LLC, but for the past 6 years, 6 years ago, it began out of a process of grieving. I had lost my paternal grandmother. Her name was Roessel, and it was very suddenly. It was very out of the blue. She got sick, and within 2 weeks, she had left us. I don't know a bigger word than shocked. I was really devastated by her loss. She was the person who really taught me to be proud of who I am as an Asantana, as a Navajo woman, to understand that I can walk into any space and bring all of me into that space. And that is powerful, especially, and I think has become my secret weapon doing this work. It was something that powered my over 15 years of experience in museums, was really to come into understanding that it was important for me to bring all of me and my experience, my indigeneity, into the spaces that we worked. And for those of you who are Indigenous, Black, other communities, people of color, you know that that's a hard space to be, to show up in all of your self in these white institutions. It's very difficult. And it was something that also led me to think about other ways of existing in this world and doing this work so that I didn't have to always be in that hard space. But it was my late grandmother who really helped me to instill and create this path. And when I told her what I was doing after I had gotten my first museum gig, she looked at me and she said, "Wow, I'm so glad you went into education." Her being herself a lifetime educator, I thought, no, I'm not in education. I work in museums. And then I started to think, I'm like, whoa, she's right. And she was like, "I'm so glad that you're doing what I do." And I never thought of what I did as what she did. But she was somebody who really created a path for me. And Grown Up Navajo began really as a way to process my grief. It was something that I was able to reflect on, the teachings, the ceremonies, the things that made me who I was as a Navajo woman and allowed me to move forward, carrying all of that knowledge, all of the power of my ancestors with me forward into those spaces. And I began to write. So Grown Up Navajo was really a blog meant to just help me cope. And it's been amazing because through the process of that, it allowed me to be braver in sharing my poetry and being more engaged in really thinking about how we can leverage Indigenous knowledge systems as ways to create bridges so that we have stronger communities, so that we recognize and really center Indigenous knowledge as something that can be centered, because our teachings as Indigenous people have been proven to be right only now through research of different topics. And I say that to mean that it's interesting how some studies talk about how, well, I was thinking about the power with my son. We have a celebration around the first laugh. And I was reading somewhere that Aristotle believed that human beings became human at the point at which they laughed, right? And it was on either TED Talks or what's the other one with Ira Glass? American Life? This American Life, yeah. It was on one of those two podcasts, and I thought, that's what we believe. And so it's funny how sometimes the ways that we center certain knowledge as being expert, which is something we'll talk about, is different depending on the community, right? So I am really excited to be here because Grown Up Navajo now is working in spaces to be able to share cultural competency from a variety of ways, by giving talks, by working with individuals via webinar, and it's something that I'm really excited about and believe in. And one of the things that I hope to kind of convey in this talk is that there are many ways that we tend to other Indigenous knowledge, the way that we push Indigenous knowledge to the side. And I think that that's something that we need to be critical of as we begin to do this work, and thinking about ways in which examining ourselves in the ways that we communicate and how we communicate is very important. Lately, there's been a really big movement, which I really appreciate, to honor Native land. The U.S. Department of Arts and Culture created this campaign, this hashtag Honor Native Land, in which they worked with a lot of Indigenous community artists to create various types of posters like the one you see here. And the idea is that when you're having a space coming together, that on the little banner at the bottom you can insert, what homelands you're on. And I thought this was a really exciting thing, and I think it's important for us, especially as educators, which I think some of you who are on this journey recognize, is that there is an importance of land acknowledgements, but it's also important to recognize that this is just the beginning, right? That these very easily can become something that, because we make it an obligation to do, can be something that is very much can become performative if we're not careful, or if we don't think it through. So it's thinking about, or challenging ourselves to think about this in a way that allows us to commit to having land acknowledgements, but also, I think more importantly, challenge ourselves to answer the question of how else can we honor the people who've lived on this land through the work that we're doing. And that can look different through all the different institutions that we work from. And what is important to note as well is that land acknowledgements at best can become tools for healing, they can become tools for truth-telling, and at its worst can be something that's obligatory, that's a check the box type of thing, and we have to be able to think critically about how we engage in these practices. So, and I think overall, one of the questions I'm most intrigued by when we think about and contextualize our work, if your institution isn't doing land acknowledgements in the public programs that you're giving or integrated into the curriculum that you're teaching school groups, is to think about, well, what does it mean to acknowledge land, especially land that we know has stories that have existed long before us? What does it mean to understand that people have and do believe that they have come from this land? One of the things that tends to happen within museum spaces is creating and treating Indigenous perspectives, or even just voices from Black, Indigenous, and other communities of color as alternate views. As well, they also believe this, as opposed to being able to center these things as being legitimate points of view, as being worth acknowledgement and acceptance. So creation stories is something that we see quite often be a way for museums to treat Indigenous communities as something that's novel, as mythical, and our presentation as institutions at times can even have real harm in that they allow a type of dehumanization, or they play into stereotypes. But what's important and critical is that creation stories really are powerful tools if we want them to be. The reason why land acknowledgements and understanding our communities and our land base and who exist in our communities is that they are rich ties to the land bases and really become places in which we can learn about a people's way of being. So there are many communities in Arizona that believe that the Grand Canyon, which is pictured here, is the place from which they emerged. They have very elaborate and detailed stories of how they have come into the places and the land that they know. So the Navajo people, the Hopi people, there are the Hualapai and Havasupai people have stories that tie them to these formations and these places. There's a place, this is Gobernador's Knob in northwestern, New Mexico. And it is where we, as Navajo people, believe one of our deities, Changey Woman, was found when she was a baby, right on top of that little bump. It's these stories that help us to contextualize and understand how rich of a history Native people carry with them. To the Quechan people in Nevada, they believe that Spirit Mountain, pictured here, is also a story, is also a place where they have rich ties of having moved from and originated from. So these places, again, are places that allow us to understand what's important to a community, why they might be gatherers in terms of the art forms or cultural belongings that they make. Just as I was explaining, there are two places I call home, and they each have their own uniqueness to them. There are things that we practice in my husband's community, being married into that are very different from what I grew up with. And all of this allows us to come to a perspective of recognizing an Indigenous worldview, and I think one that is not stuck in the history, quote unquote, quote. We remember last year that in June of 1868, there's the Navajo Long Walk, which was it was a forcible removal of my community of people that moved them over 300 miles away from our homelands. Last year was the 150-year anniversary, and I put that in air quotes because it's not a happy anniversary or commemoration of this period, but it's not something you read about in history books. There are many different places where we have opportunities of learning that can be integrated in curriculum because these things, as I've noted here, they may be seen as historical, but there is a way that generations today feel them. They are something that we carry with us today, in that we are really this generation of people, like my generation and younger, feel a rich tie to these events because of the ways that they've been carried on. And they are exceptional ways in which we are able to, I think in some ways, empathize with our ancestors, in that we feel and know as best we can that struggle. And so when we omit as museums and refuse or oftentimes overlook these historical events, they can become really detrimental to us. I've noted here, there are a lot of, these are really rich stories of removal, very detrimental historical events that have occurred. And so it's something that we have to know. For those of you who are in Minnesota, remember or have probably read about the incident at the Walker Art Center with the public, a lot of you are nodding your heads, with the public sculpture that was planned for their sculpture garden outside. There was this for those of you who aren't aware, there was this artist, a non-Indigenous artist, who was invited into the sculpture garden to build a sculpture that he was known for. And it was a public art piece that was a replica of a gallows. While this artist had been working in exploring this vein of work, what was not considered or consulted about, or consulted with or to, was the communities that were home, that called Minnesota home, Minneapolis specifically, or that what we now know as Minneapolis. They were very close to the opening. I mean, close in museum time. It was being constructed, and it was brought to light that this was the plan. And there was this huge public outcry from the Dakota people, the Lakota people, the native people in that area, because one of the most traumatic and very recent within federal Indian policy timeframe was the Dakota 38, which was the execution of Dakota and Lakota men there in what we now call Minneapolis. And it was one of the largest mass executions, and it was ordered by by Abraham Lincoln. And there is still much needed healing within that community and in society, because we don't acknowledge this. There's a lot of whitewashing of history that this also ties into, but the reality was that this institution failed to see that this event would be a trigger point for these historical events that happened. And what was awful about this is that within this one instance of not consulting, not having ongoing dialogues with the Indigenous communities there, they created really a new direction for themselves, and having to navigate and challenge them to a whole other level of doing reparative work with their community because of this instance. And it was very public. I mean, many of us read about it in the news. It was something that required mediation between the community and the museum, and the museum completely surrendered the artwork. They follow, within the facilitation, moved toward whatever, really going, moving in a way to really repair that deep cut as best they could in that moment, and then trying to think about ways of acknowledging their disregard. And so that is an example. While we can think potentially about something that, well, this was over 150, or 100 years ago, who cares? These are lived traumas that Indigenous people carry. And there are also good things in that, but I think we have to be, in our history, there are good things in our history that we have to acknowledge Indigenous people also hold, but that because Indigenous communities continuously fight for acknowledgement, whether that's cultural justice or just justice overall, that when we're working with our communities, we have to acknowledge the power that museums hold and the privilege, as Makiba was talking about, that we tend to, the lens of privilege that we are looking at things. And so it really allows us an opportunity to think more critically about how we engage in our communities. And we see, the Walker was really put in kind of this national spotlight for this really insensitive event, but there are a lot of other events that happen every day with museums that don't make it in the news, that are just as damaging to the relationships that museums have with communities, and we'll get to that in a little bit. But first I want to say is that, when I started doing this, when I moved into the work of decolonization, I specifically naming the work, I didn't realize that I was working in this way. It didn't seem that it was relevant to that the word, the label decolonization was something that could apply to this. But then I began to think about, well, what really is decolonization? And it's thinking about power. So I want to start by just saying, like, here's this picture, a very typical scene in a museum that has cultural belongings. And can you just kind of name some things in terms of what you see? You can just shout out what comes to mind.
Distance.
Stanchions? Gloves? Distance? All right. You guys are awesome. You guys are all educators. I like this. This is so easy. So, yes, absolutely. So there's distance, there's gloves. You know, we have this, white appearing woman, and she's showing the bottom of a work. So whether that's the signature or the base of the basket, we have a woman who's craning over the stanchions. And from the looks of it, like, it's a pretty small group of people, right? What's really interesting is that this particular picture was actually in a tribal museum's newspaper online. And, you know, for those of us who have Google alerts, like, it was like decolonization, or maybe it was a repatriation. I don't know, whatever the alert was. But I was looking at this, and it made me so angry. So this is the members of the Confederated Tribes of the Grand Ronde in Oregon, who are on a visit to the British Museum, and they were there because they were 120 years later, after they had been taken, were facilitating a return of cultural belongings from the British Museum back to their tribe. It was a very joyful article. It was one that was really excited. They interviewed community members about just how amazing it was to be able to bring these belongings home. I mean, imagine being separated. I mean, these generations of people didn't even know the power of these belongings, but knew that they were all the way on the other side of, like, the country and the ocean, and then to be knowing that they were able to bring them back was really beautiful. And then I see this picture, and I think, wow, like, that's such, like, their joy and this picture are two different things for me. One, because having friends who have had and tried to have conversations or consultation with the British Museum, and the different ways that their institution become such harborers of power in their policies and procedures, that it's very something that was frustrating to know that there were many hoops that this community had to get through just to get to this particular table, right? Two, to know that having been in these spaces, I thought it was really funny that they had these stanchions in such a way, like it's not that big a group of people. Like, like, this is really fascinating to me that this is the way that they're choosing to engage with these community members who, I imagine, for those of you who work with, belongings in some way, whether they're contemporary or historical, that you've had dialogue to get to this point. So in a sense, you know who these people are, right? Even if you know a couple people. So it's funny to me that's like, you're strangers. Like, this is like a public program, and you have, or you're working with children, which even then I would still be upset. Like, there's this really interesting dynamic here. And then secondly, like, we know, or at least I can tell, that these things are not of their community. So that you have, like, some Plains belongings that are like other belongings from beyond their own people, but even still, like, it's a really interesting photo to include in this article. And I kept asking myself, well, what's being communicated in that photo? And to me, what resonates, like, what's being communicated is, like, who's in charge, right? Who's in charge in that? You have, this is very similar to the scene in Black Panther, where you have this white curator who's telling, in the instance of the movie, a black man about belongings that are from his ancestors in this very scholarly, jargony, like, dismissive way. And what's interesting about that scene in Black Panther is you have a woman, and actually what's funny is many of you commented this on the way in here to this space. Well, I can't believe they're letting us carry our coffee in this space, right? And one thing that I know, us as museum educators, we're all watching Black Panther, and we see the white woman, right? Like, just her having her drink in the gallery space was a symbol of power and privilege, right? And so it's really interesting where, I mean, maybe not everybody recognized that, but I know, like, us, we're like, whoa, like, that's really, like, this added layer, right, of, like, privilege that she's not even, like, it's not even something that she's explicit about, but if you're in this, you know, those of us in this room, like, we know, like, that was this really interesting power play that is being communicated in the in this scene within the movie. And then to have that very, like, regurgitated information was very reminiscent of this photo. So you have this woman in gloves, and I've worked at museums where we have tribal members who come in, and we give them gloves, or they don't have to take gloves, you know, if they don't want to. Like, we'll let them know that, well, you know, this particular belonging, you know, potentially was treated with arsenic, so you might want to wear gloves, right? So there are things where, like, we, you know, try to let them know, but in the end, like, try to take this place of, well, you're the driver. These are your belongings. I worked at this on this project one time where we had this man who he was Gila River, so he was Akma Otham from down in the Sonoran Desert, and he had come in to do a video. It was looking at tools. He was a shell carver. He was looking at tools that were his ancestors, so from the Hohokam people. So these are potentially like 1 AD to like 500, no, 1300 AD, right? These, like, a lot of granite tools, like hard rocks. And so the curator that I was working with was like, okay, well, Tim, can you go ahead and show us how they would be used? Like, you know, and she meant, like, gesturally, right? Because they were on loan from the Smithsonian. And so then Tim's like, okay. So he starts, like, grinding, like, you see, well, this is what I would do, and this is blah, blah. And then she's like, and I, like, we're recording. This is for, like, one of the, if you've been to the Herd, it's like the didactics. There's those videos and things that you listen to. They were cutting edge when we put them in, but I don't know that they're there. Anyway, so what's interesting is then I'm looking at the curator, and her eyes are, like, bulging, like, and I can see her thinking, like, this is a loan item, like, this, like, what are we gonna do? But she just, like, let it happen, and I was just, like, so thankful that there wasn't a moment of, like, don't do that, right? But I thought, like, well, of course he's gonna do that. Like, these are belongings that are meant to be used. These were things that our people made to help us in our daily lives. So whether they're shell carving tools, whether it was a basket, you know, like, we also, like, as Indigenous people, we also know that things are fragile. Like, we're not gonna, like, roughly shake a basket. And I think sometimes there's this hesitancy, or this, like, this just mistrust, or with certain museum professionals at times that don't recognize that, you know, well, we too want these things to exist, right? And so it's really, like, thinking about how to do this work. And so really the power of decolonization is to allow us and provide us a lens to see how power is being played out within our spaces. And I think if we can think about decolonization in this way, it becomes something that's usable. It becomes something that's a tool for us to think about how we can decolonize our practices, whether we're working with children that are coming through, you know, in a urban, you know, museum, downtown setting, to communities that are working with adults in rural settings. Like, there are ways for us to use decolonization and really allow ourselves to activate our awareness of the systems at play. Decolonization allows us to center Native voice, and within your facilitated groups, like, you will kind of be able to think a bit more about this and think about how these are applications of decolonization. And I come to this work, I want to say decolonization is something that has become more and more prevalent in our terminology within museums, but also within, if you already work with Indigenous populations or other specific communities, there is a language around decolonization, and I think that before I worked at San Diego Museum of Man, I would never say like, oh, I want to decolonize museums, because it didn't seem to me. I didn't know that language, even though I now can see how my practices and beliefs and even my upbringing are really allowing me to think about how to challenge the way power plays out in museums. And that's one of the reasons why I do this educative work within museums, is because it allows us a place. They're very unique systems where we can have community come in and see this application of privilege and opportunities for us to, in a way, kind of social engineer so that we can challenge people's previous thoughts, to allow them to consider a new way of thinking, a new way of knowing. And so these are examples of how decolonization can help that. So it can center Indigenous voice. It can help us evaluate, reevaluate really like who the expert is. So recognizing, again, going back to that photo of the, community members from Oregon who are at the British Museum, like this is their material. And they no doubt, just like a lot of our communities these days, they have intermarried with other people. They have an awareness outside of just their own experience. Like we are modern people. And I think that's really critical for us to know, is that we are existing today. And it seems redundant to say that, or very obvious, but it's really important because of the pervasiveness of stereotypes, particularly with Indigenous communities, because we aren't represented in truthful ways very often. We aren't represented through our own lens. It's beginning to change now, but we are still fighting these very, very old tools, and it's something that is really important for us to think about ways to center Native knowledge. And decolonization also allows us to acknowledge like the tensions that exist within spaces. And I'll say more about that in a little bit. What's important for us to do in entering this work is acknowledging that museums continue to be places that perpetuate harm, especially for Native people. When we don't acknowledge these four tenets are things I think are really foundational, like in doing this work, is thinking about, or really just acknowledging the fact that these spaces have been involved in overlooking the rights of community members in various ways. To that second point, there are a lot of museums and universities that still ignore the rights of Indigenous people, Black communities, and other people of color in various ways. Specifically with regard to, some of you may be familiar with NAGPRA, which is the Native American Graves Protection Repatriation Act, which is the federal policy that was passed in 1990, I believe, that was essentially required the museums to return all belongings from the museums back to communities if they were designated as ceremonial, human or ancestral remains, or were funerary or coming from graves. This was something that took a long time for it to happen. And when you meet a lot of Indigenous museum professionals, there is this whole vein of work that exists in repatriation because of the procedures that this legislation created that museums are supposed to follow. What's not talked about is that even though this is now 2018, there are still museums that ignore the requests or put on the back burner the requests from tribal communities for, they call them kind of contest, like a NAGPRA contest, contesting a NAGPRA kind of a claim, or issuing a NAGPRA claim. And so these are ways in which a tribe can stake a claim to X item that they know is in the belonging. By federal law, anytime a tribal entity makes a request to a museum, they can say, like, we want to know how many of our belongings are in your existence, like what are the descriptions. They're supposed to comply. They are also supposed to comply as those things are contested to be returned. And I know that there are different institutions, because just like museum professionals overall, like, you know, Native professionals or people working in communities, we talk to each other, right? So we know and understand that there are certain institutions that still won't answer phones, will ignore emails. And so there's still things that museums and universities like want to hold on to in the name of science. Like I will say, like UC Berkeley is one that continuously like ignores and is still clinging onto the ancestor remains of various indigenous people in the sake of science, in the sake of anthropology, for us to continue to be studied. That's happening today in 2018. And so it's really important. Like, this is why, to that first point, museums in particular can still be viewed as, you know, places where harm is being perpetuated. And so it's really important for us to acknowledge, you know, if you have a community, like a high population of Native people within your, in and around your museum, or that are one of your target audiences, and you continuously wonder, like, I wonder why, you know, Indigenous people, like, we see them going to other events, but they're not coming here. Well, there is also like this issue of trust. Like, people go to places they trust. They go to places where they think they belong or they can see themselves in. And so if that's not happening in your institution, then there's a reason for that. Either those Indigenous communities don't feel safe, or they don't feel it's for them. And in either one of those cases, those are ways to critically think about, well, how can we navigate this and move this forward? Again, you know, just underscoring the fact that there's this long history of dehumanization within the spaces, because museums are colonial structures. They are not something that are Indigenous in nature. They aren't our way. And Jaclyn has a museums are not neutral button. I think that's also important too, is that to recognize if you do have Indigenous communities coming to you for space rentals, for using your resources, one, they might potentially, they're potentially seeing you as a partner in some way. But when we communicate to these communities that, well, you know, we don't want to host this XY event because, well, we're like neutral. We're trying not to take a position on this. Like, that is also a position, right? And we need to like acknowledge the fact that, yes, like museums are going, like, we still have mission statements. There are reasons why we're in existence and for whatever reason, but it's really trying to challenge ourselves and our museum administration to think about, well, what are we communicating and how can we do it better, right? Because overall, and the way that I try to think about my work is that within every interaction with community members and their belongings has the potential to move us closer to healing. So I think about decolonization in my mind and my work as a spectrum. And so over here we have harm, and over here we have healing. And every day we make decisions, and it doesn't just work with Indigenous people. We can pick a community of people that we want to work with or we're working with, and we can make a decision to move our ourselves closer toward healing or closer to harm. And this works especially if you're thinking about communities that you know have attention, maybe they're not necessarily coming, or there was an issue that happened in the past with the museum, whatever that looks like. There's a way for us to engage and move us in one direction or the other, but recognize that that swings, right? It's a pendulum that moves back and forth, and we need to consider like how that happens. One of the biggest teachers in this work that I've been doing is Dr. Amy Lone Tree, and she literally wrote the book on decolonizing museums. She is a Ho-Chunk scholar and professor, and she really narrows or tells about the truth-telling, tells about decolonization through this triad, which includes truth-telling, collaboration, and centering Indigenous knowledge and voices. So truth-telling, I think, is something that best, or at least most recently, I was really introduced to in the best way through the San Diego Museum of Man. My mentor and boss, former boss, Ben Garcia, many of you know, he really, one of the things that he said is that this work of decolonizing museums only happens at the speed of trust. And I think that idea in general can not just be related to decolonizing work, but just generally, like working with communities, whether they're school children or outreach, whatever that looks like, it happens at the speed of trust. And so we can't make it go any faster than the community wants. And for us to like work at the speed of trust, that in itself is decolonizing our practices so that we are not the expert. That, you know, just because we have a grant deadline and we're supposed to meet XYZ, you know, metrics, like it doesn't necessarily mean that grant deadline is going to be important to this community. And it really, it's, you know, it shouldn't be, in the fact that like they have their own metrics, their own values that they work from. Again, collaboration is something that can look in various ways, but again, it really means co-leading in really sharing power. And all of these really relate to how we can shift power away from museums in real meaningful ways. Lastly, centering Indigenous voices. You know, what does that look like if we allow people to be the experts in their own cultural lives, right? In the way that they live out their everyday, whether that's curating a museum, whether that's thinking about programs collectively, like with them, but then really letting them drive the focus of how to engage. One of the practices I try to implement within my practice is creative destruction. And so thinking about and examining places where there might be tension, maybe why isn't something working? And so one of the things that one of my greatest moments of learning was while working at the Heard Museum. We received this grant to do this amazing work of being able to go to different communities and facilitate these. The title was awful. It was called like, I always say like we didn't write the grant, but but it was called like Master Artist Workshops, and just like the idea of like master, like that is not a decolonized title. And so it was like Master Artist Workshops, and the goal though was really to like bring a teacher in and then teach people. So it was allowing them to transfer their own knowledge to mostly their own tribal members, but then they would, depending on the instructor, would allow other people to engage or not engage with their specific practice. But it was in things like basket weaving, textiles, and the one that we were really kind of curious and scared about was pottery. And we knew that we had to, right, because the grant said so, we had to work with the Puebloan community, and we said that we would facilitate a workshop that was around Pueblo pottery. what we knew that we didn't really know how to do this. So myself and my partner, who is Comanche, were like, well, I think we should do a site visit. That was like, at least we did that right. We were like, okay, we know we need to do this. We set up a meeting. We're like, we're going to go to New Mexico and we'll talk to this person, and then we'll just spend 3 days and see like how we can set this up. So we go to the first person, and she was a Pueblo woman. She's like, well, I just want to say that, like, I did a Pueblo workshop within my Pueblo community. I guess in background information, in New Mexico, there are 19 Pueblos. All of them are autonomous. They all have different practices, different leadership, different everything. And so she's like, well, in my Pueblo, we're trying to facilitate this. And what we had to do was that only people that were approved by tribal council could teach it. Only approved people from tribal council could take it, and it meant that they had to be clan people because of the way we were teaching it. Because what we had said was like, we wanted to do start to finish. And she's like, the reason why all of these protocols were set up was because for us to teach the harvesting of clay, it's something that's an earned knowledge. Right? And so for them to go to places where they harvest clay, like not everyone gets to do that. So there were all these things that their tribal council, which is their governments, like tribal council is what runs indigenous nations. And so we were like, oh my goodness, like we just wanted to teach a pottery workshop, right? And so it was really like this learning coming from Arizona, and let alone like my partner in this is, Comanche, so I'm completely from Oklahoma. And so it was this really incredible like lesson of this first person was like, well, these are all the things I had to do. And I remember riding in that car on the way back, and I was talking to him, and I thought, I don't know if we're going to get to do this. But they had. Like, he was very in this place of like, well, she said to talk to this person. And so we set up a meeting with this next person. And that next meeting, he's like, what she did say, she's like, well, this particular teacher is one that you could talk to and see. If you can get him, then he can help you, right? So then we talked to the next person, and then he was like a little more giving of like, well, maybe if you only did Pueblo people, but I would definitely talk to this teacher. But it was the same person. And so then by the third meeting, right, we went to this other space, and we're like, well, this is what we want to do. We now recognize that all of these things might be hindrances to this, but what do you think? And so our third person said, well, we think that you should consider this, and then I think you need to talk to this instructor, who was like 3 people were saying that this was our guy. So we kept calling this person. All of these meetings were like, well, this is his number, and then we emailed him, and then somebody else had, well, no, his number changed. So then we called that next number, and then finally, like, he called us back and was like, yeah, well, why don't you take me to lunch? And we'll talk about it. And we're like, all right. So like our last day in New Mexico before we went to catch our flight, we were sitting in Santa Fe, and he was telling us, well, this is how I will teach it. Do you agree to this? And we were like, yes. And it meant that we weren't doing from start to finish. It would be inter-Pueblo and not inter-tribal. And what was so beautiful by the time we got to the program was that it allowed us, there were whole parts of this that were taught in Keres, which is the language of the instructor. And so myself and my partner, we were like, we didn't know. Like there were just like massive amounts of time throughout this whole period, like that it was so beautiful. Like we didn't know what the heck he was saying, and it was not for us, right? And so I say that to say there are places and times when we have to recognize that the work that we're doing has to be earned, that it's not for us. We can facilitate our program, we can create the foundation for it, but that to be in my belief, in my way of knowing and being, is that to be in museum education, we facilitate a conversation, we create the foundation, and it's up to the community and the community members to be able to play, to create, and to move things forward. And sometimes that means that that's not for us, which is something that allowed us in this workshop. So creative destruction is really to like be able to destroy what you make so that you can think about it and retool it in a way to move it forward. And I think that this really allows us to, or something that helps me to personally facilitate this is to constantly consider the question of what's mine. Well, what's mine in my practice? And for me, what I try to aim for every day is that at the end of the day, nothing is mine in my practice. Like the ideal is that I will be of service. And on some days, though, like it's my ego. Like, no, I want the accolades. I want like a nice introduction, and I want to be able to be the center of attention, right? And be able to be in a specific place. But on other days, it will look different. And so again, like that idea of a spectrum. You normally ask this question, people can break up into groups and they talk about, well, what is theirs in your practice? And separating out, well, what is like you as an individual versus what are the values of the institution? And one of the most beautiful examples a woman shared with us was this idea. She worked as an educator at a theater. And she said that every time we go to, whether it's rehearsal or before a performance, she's like, I take 3 breaths. I take 3 breaths before that curtain opens, and those 3 breaths are mine. Like, that's mine, right? And everything else, I'm working in the training with the institution, with the training of the actors, and so everything else can shift and change. And I thought that was really beautiful, and I think that that's an easier way of thinking about this question of what's mine. And you all in your groups will be able to think about that. Well, what is mine? What's important to me as an individual doing this work? But also then how and where. I think when we get to a place of being able to see what's ours, we can see kind of the boundaries, or maybe not boundaries, but we see this kind of orb like around us and how that bumps up against other beliefs, whether those are the communities, whether that's the institution that we're working at, and it allows us to move more fluidly with that. Is a philosophy that I think is really important. It comes from my community. It's a Navajo concept, and there are many ways of relationships, and kinship is something that's really important to all Indigenous communities, and is ours, but it's not simply that we're related to each other. When I introduced myself, I said my 4 clans, and we, as Navajo people, were taught that you say that as really the way that you're bringing in the people that you come from with you. So that says more about you than your name does. So I had said, like, I am red running into the water people. I am born for, my dad's clan is the Towering House people. My maternal grandfather's clan is the Bitterwater clan. My paternal grandfather was the Monteith clan from Scotland. And so these are the people that I come from. But it's not just saying that I come from these people, it's saying because I come from these people, I am responsible to those people and to you because I'm saying that these are the people I come from. And so is what allows us to practice better community engagement. It allows us to be in a place of taking action, and it allows us strength. And So I'm going to close with a couple slides, and this is a scene from a puberty ceremony that we have in Navajo culture, and it's this young girl who, when she has her first period, she has this ceremony, and I love talking about this. This is actually one of the foundations of Grown Up Navajo, but we don't have time for all of that storytelling. But what's amazing about it, and within our ceremonies, is that people come together. So this is me in this picture when I was 12. My dad's a photographer, and there are fortunately that means I have lots of photographs of me experiencing and living my culture, because he would take photos like of our family life, our Navajo life, and so this is me, and what we would do, and we still do, is that when a girl gets her period, there's a 4-day ceremony, and people come together for our ceremonies. We believe that when somebody is celebrating, like in the case of the Kinalda, or somebody is sick, people come together. But what I think is beautiful about this is that this person's 12, right? Like, I'm distancing myself, right? When you see the people running behind this person, and this is, if any of you have been to the Navajo Reservation, then you can still see this today at different points. So we believe that the young girl is supposed to run early in the morning before the sun comes up, and then at noon. And each day she runs further and further and further. And she's also practicing like a fasting in some way. So there are like certain things you can't eat, certain things you can't have. You're really seen as this shape of clay, and you're supposed to be molded. But then there's also this aspect of this girl being able to mold people. And there's this power that we believe this woman, now that she's had her period, she's a woman, she is connected to one of our deities, the changing woman, and she kind of not necessarily becomes her, but she displays the qualities that she's going to have throughout her life. So as you know, in non-Navajo society, people look at this and it's like, this is a 12-year-old, right? But the reality is that she's being introduced to the community, and the community is coming together and showing her and telling her that we are going to be here for you, and you will be here for us because of this continuing like lifeblood now that's moving through you, and going forward. And so this idea, to me, like, this is what leadership looks like. She might be the person who's like setting the pace for the run, but she's only able to run as strong as she is because all of these people are yelling out behind her. And we do this call, it's like, woo, like that. And it's so beautiful, especially in the morning run. But it's this idea, and sometimes, like, I remember this moment. I remember being pitch black, running in the dawn, and hearing my aunties, my mom, my dad, my brothers, my sisters yelling behind me. And I can't see them, but we're going, like, we're all running together. And so to me, this idea of, like, museum, like, education is this movement toward, like, together, right? And setting a pace, but, like, you can only move, like, as fast as you can. And because the people are, like, going behind you, and there are times when you want to stop, but, like, they're moving, right? So as we think about this as a decolonized path, you know, we can set the pace. Once we start doing this work, it then begins to get carried by people in the community going forward. And I say that to say is that, especially for those of us who have worked or work at institutions that have cultural belongings, there's a real tendency to make the work that we're doing about the materiality of things. And we have to remember that there are people that still believe in the power that those cultural belongings have. And so we can think about ways of being able to honor Indigenous perspective by the language we use, by not calling it artifacts, by really shifting our way toward connecting, you know, so whether that's a cultural resource, whether that's to use the term, I use cultural belongings because I feel that that centers the fact that some of these belongings are things that weren't equitably traded or obtained by museums in a lot of cases. But whatever, like, works for you, like, you can shift your language in a way that really decenters ownership or decenters the institution and moving ourselves toward that. And so this is actually a question that my husband had offered when we were doing some work around really trying to communicate decolonization and what that can look like. So, and this is really the closing slide and something that you'll be able to reflect on with the groups that you'll be breaking out to. But thinking about, how do you ensure the work that you do with the cultural belongings you steward are valued by the people and community from where they come? So how are they, the communities, centered in your work? So whether that's through people, different persons who are in I don't want to say in charge, but existing as knowledge holders, through the cultures. So what does that look through a truth-telling of history? Sometimes that history can also be truth-telling within your own institution, in the way that you treat different community members. Sometimes, we as museums and professionals working in that, we have a lot of procedures, and sometimes we forget that communities, that rigidity is something that doesn't necessarily always make the best welcoming tool for communities that we are trying to engage and trying to welcome. And so we need to be aware of that. I think also to that standpoint, even just capacity. Sometimes we want to be in a place of being able to welcome lots of people and, recognizing just the limitations of our own space or our own staff to be able to do that. But also through our actions. Again, grounding how do we make our actions, on every day, or maybe that's a monthly commitment in some way. At the San Diego Museum of Man, we would attend, as part of the reparative work that we were doing, we would commit to attending the cultural committees that were held by the homeland communities, the Kumeyaay. And so when they would set a meeting, we would make sure we would be there. And they had lots of meetings about a variety of different things. And so it was really just trying to show, again, our commitment to what we had said. And so these are things that are really important. And I think that overall, going back to the ways that my Indigenous way of knowing is to continually think about our communities as being something that is really integrative. We, as Navajo people, believe that we call ourselves Dene in our language, and it means the people. But we also have a term called Bala'ashla'i, and Bala'ashla'i is five-fingered people. The five-fingered people are ones who are human, and that we're all connected through being Bala'ashla'i people. And that's meant to distinguish us from the four-legged people, from the other beings that exist in our world that we also exist in, and that our culture is alive in that we practice and engage with these policies really states of law, I guess, as we think about it, fundamental law, within our culture. And so that is the context through which I work and really try to center my work in, as now a small business owner, and going back to consulting after, both having moved from the work at San Diego Museum of Man, but also just after having a son, what does that look like? And even the work of bringing my son and being able to make this a family trip, almost out of necessity. My husband and I are here, but in that way of bringing my son into spaces, we believe all spaces are for children in my community. And so I hope that, and by being able to bring him into this space, it's also part of my decolonization practice, because I think sometimes we forget that the work that we're doing as adults also is hopefully in service of those little ones coming forward. So with all of that to say, we want to have time for questions. So thank you so much. So, questions? She's behind you then next.
Hello.
Hi.
You kind of spoke about it, but can you kind of go deeper in the importance of decolonizing your audiences also?
Yeah, so one of the things so in public presentations that I have done, and most of the audiences that I'm talking to are much like this, like professional like groups. But one of the things that has an opportunity that we had recently was talking to a group in Flagstaff, and it was a public night program. And one of the things I think that museums can help in facilitating with audiences is really creating a space for them to be critical, and not critical, and I say critical in the essence of critique. Like how can we get us get our communities of museum goers to help us co-create the material that we're working with. So specifically, whether that's talking about and engaging like their voice, like in co-curating exhibitions, but also to be vocal about, well, what aren't you seeing that you want to see more of? There are also opportunities, I think, for the museum goers to be in the place of making space for them to ask specifically about the like who's creating material like within the institution. So talking specifically about, we were talking there specifically about how do we get, well, I'm trying to think of how did I say it? Really challenging ourselves to be in a place of allowing the audience to say that, we want curators of color, we want a museum staff. Like if you're creating an exhibition or program around Indigenous communities, well then are Indigenous people like actually like making this program? Like are there opportunities for us to have a community advisory board that is action oriented and not just a rubber stamp type of thing, because we've seen those, and those can be just as damaging, like in any, whether it's Indigenous or not. If you have advisory committees of community members, you want to think really hard about why they exist, but I think sometimes that invitation for decolonizing audiences can come from this type of taking action, or at least that's the way I think of it mostly, is I want to see more of this preparing us to think about how they can be a more active voice, which I think challenges the museum in itself to really move away from operating in a fear-based aspect of like, well, how, I know, like we need to be the experts, like we need to be in charge. What if they say X, Y, Z, and then, well, what are we gonna say about that, But I also think too is that sometimes a lot of these audiences, when we think about decolonizing the museum audience or just audiences, is that I'm of the mindset that if we don't work from a proactive stance, if your institution doesn't work from a proactive stance, you're going to come to a place in time where your audience is going to be doing that like on its own. So we look at like Decolonize This Place and like that like movement of people that are powering the occupation of the Brooklyn Museum and the occupation of the Whitney Museum. Like these are things that are active and they have demands like in terms of, well, these are things that we're actively asking for. That in and of itself, like for that to be happening at two of the most like well-known, like most privileged spaces like in the United States, like there's ways that can happen in our institutions too, right? And so to me, like that's an example of what decolonizing audience can be, and I'm sure from my perspective, right? And again, also I think it can also look different depending on the community that you operate from too.
Hi. In understanding the stories of belongings a little bit more, I'd love if you could share a little bit more about bending time and multiverse.
Yeah, so one of the things that I think related to a story from my husband's community. So the Pueblo Revolt is, I guess I should say, I believe in the I identify as an Indigenous futurist. I believe it's really which stems from Afrofuturism. And the term Indigenous futurism was coined by Grace Dillon. She talks specifically about how it is, in its most innate state, really radical for us to envision, especially with this oppressive history that we have as Indigenous people. It's most radical for us as Indigenous people to envision ourselves in the future, in a future that is like sci-fi and tech and incredibly beyond our existence now, that we can, for us and our ability to do that is very powerful. And simultaneously, I believe that because of the way that I was brought up as a traditional woman, we have knowledge holders and medicine people in my family, but in our communities, that have incredible amounts of power. When we think about things that are dream-based, the power of dreams, the power of plant medicine, that these are all things that have it's becoming so like woo-woo and like mystic now, but I'm just putting it out there. But that is the colonization like of what I'm saying, so I'm not gonna worry about that. Okay, so I'm not gonna preface it with we're taking back the layers, I'm taking it back. So this idea of what I believe are, those type of knowledge holders and medicine people to be able to do, of being able to have these mystic aspects to their work and being able to communicate to different people through plants, through the knowledge that has been given to us. We actually, maybe I'll just tell it from my own history. As I was talking, I worked on an audio documentary about the Long Walk, and it was this, in that story, we talked about my ancestor, who was my great-great-great-grandmother, who was removed from our homelands, and she was taken, again, 300 miles away from where our homestead is now, from where my husband and I got married, to this place in southeastern New Mexico. She escaped, and the story of her escape detailed how she used specific songs to avoid capture by the cavalry at that time. So there were songs, medicine songs, that she used because she knew the sacred names of things that allowed her to cloak, herself and her ability. And that is a story that I carry with me, and I can feel it. Like, I can feel that, and especially now that I have my son, that idea of being able to return home. And I think that being in connection to that power is a reminder to the particles of myself that used to know how to do those things. And so to me, that bending of time is that ability that if we can think about what we call historical events in a way that melt time away, that no, it didn't happen 150 years ago, then if it didn't happen 150 years ago, then why do I feel it in my bones? That separation, but also why does it feel so good that every time when I come home from my husband's place, when I drive in and I see my homelands, I see the sandstone, I see our house, I see all of these things that I grew up with, why do I also feel that so much? And I think I believe and was taught that it's because of that ability, that if we can look at it through that Indigenous lens of not knowing time, in the way that we know it now, as in I have 5 minutes for questions, right? That then we can come to this place of being able to accept it in a different way. And so I think the other piece of that is that There are many, and that's specific to my community, but there are many ways, and I was going to say, with my husband's Puebloan community, they have the Pueblo Revolt, and that happened in 1860, and it's something that is carried on by him, and it inspires his artwork, but really from this place of being able to reflect on it from the knowledge of his ancestors. And so there's this active way, and I know that other like Black communities, in the way that they carry on stories, in the way other communities of color carry on stories, specifically attached to the indigeneity, that there is this aspect of being able to exist. And multiversing specifically is a theory from quantum physics, and it relates to being able to exist in multiple time frames at different points. So being able to be in multiple planes and exist in the same time. I'm really fascinated by quantum physics and the ability, that idea of multiversing, that there's not just one universe, but even that, how do we decolonize the idea of universe, right? That's like multiverses and existence. And again, that's another talk. So another question.
At the museum where I work, we have the American Indian Art Collection, and you began by having just like a slide at the beginning of your public programs and acknowledging the land. And so in the way that words matter, the American Indian Art Collection, is there a way to invite people to learn more and just appreciate the many different communities and many different people that one phrase represents?
Oh, absolutely. I think a couple things. I think that there are definitely, I challenge you to continue to bring in Indigenous voices and scholars. There are plenty of us that can be invited to give public programs, to be invited to explore the museum's cultural belongings there. There are ways, I don't know if many of you probably have seen, so the Met got a lot of acclaim just from shifting like their recent exhibit from where it used to be in like the native collection from the Oceania to like North America, which I'm like, let's like low bar. But that being said, they also, like, it's a big deal, but it's also like, really? Like, it's 2018 and you're the Met. In addition to that, they also started they included in their exhibition a land acknowledgement. That's part of that. But I also challenge them and you to think about, so you can put that like in the exhibition, like whose land like your museum occupies, which is important. But I think that's just the beginning, being able to do that and committing to thinking about, well, who in your community can be on your board of trustees. I think that that's also something for thinking about privilege in museums. We need, how much time do you have to talk about Indigenous, Black, and people of color like on boards of trustees? Like we need them in decision-making positions. And I think that that's critical in the work that we're doing. And I think that in that process is if you're going to engage in those people, being really committed to the work, acknowledging overall, like how are we really setting up our staff members who are people of color, who are Black, who are Indigenous, to be successful in the museum spaces that we have, because again, going back to what Makiba said, they are stressful spaces. We often don't acknowledge the fact that a lot of this anti-racism work is being done by our frontline staff on a day-to-day basis with a public that is very insensitive and ignorant about these communities. So how are we supporting them? We want to talk about high turnover there. You know, like again, like we can talk a lot about the the ways that we set up these spaces for success. But sometimes it's really about how do we creatively engage in somebody who, whether that's a consultant, to be able to look at, okay, we have this center, what more can it do? What ways can we think about this innovatively? And so, I mean, we can talk more about it. You can email me, and your museum can bring me. One more up there.
Good morning. Wow. Good morning.
Good morning.
So to be fully transparent, my mother is a docent at the Heard Museum.
Yay!
Phyllis Manning.
Awesome.
And
Phyllis! Oh my God. Phyllis is amazing.
Phyllis is amazing. Phyllis became a docent after coming to an NAEA conference with me 18 years ago.
She told me that.
First of all, we've been texting throughout your talk. And she sends her love, and so we have a question together.
Okay.
And we've been talking a lot recently with many things going on in Phoenix with docent programs about systems of power and the role docents play in shaping community. And so we would be very interested to know, what have you found to be some of the most successful strategies for engaging docents in decolonization work?
Yeah. That's awesome. Again, so I think it's very much similar to the comment about like frontline staff. I think what's really important to recognize is we need to spend more time like working with our docents. Because what's been really interesting, so for my last 3 years that I was at the Heard, one of the many things that I was doing was facilitating the docent training program as the director of education. But what was really interesting was that it was the first time in over 25 years that was taught exclusively by an Indigenous woman. For those of you who don't know, the Heard Museum is a Native Arts and Culture organization, and so yes, it was needed, yes, it was progressive, but at the same time, it was also something that it should have been coming from that first person for a long time before it was coming from me. It's really, I think, helpful for us, especially with docents, to spend a great deal of time teaching them to unlearn. And unlearning is really an aspect of decolonization, to spend time with our docents, to be in places of exploring how to retell things. In the case of the Heard, the docent program was really different in that it was mostly a lot of people who were really in their second career, in that they retired early and they were working full-time. I would say working full-time because many of them, Phyllis included, was there just as much as staff was there. And so it really becomes this place of, well, how do we create a system for engaging people who are coming from multiple fields? And sometimes, especially I see with Native people, the risk is that we have a lot of people who are archaeologists or anthropologists based, and so they're coming from this knowledge way of really persistent othering in and coming from, and unknowingly, I think sometimes even not understanding that the way that those fields have caused harm to Native people, but it's also simultaneously the reason why they're interested and want to be there and make them so committed, right? So I think there needs to be a lot of work in museums to designate one person to be able to be this person who can facilitate a program that includes like anti-racism work and training, that includes not just cultural competency, but like how do we engage and think. That's what, I guess, if I could redo it again, that's not what my training was, but if there was a way to be able to engage in anti-racism training, but also how to support docents who could be allies like in the work that they're doing. Because along with frontline staff, a lot of docents are the ones who are meeting the public. And again, that's a public that can be very ignorant and coming with their own issues. And so some docents, it really depends on the docent, right? They're either maybe unwilling or unable to facilitate a dialogue in a way that doesn't help them to be a better ally. That instead encourages, whether it's complacency in some ways, but also sometimes just a way of letting comments continue. And so I think we need to think about, well, how can docent programs really begin to move toward that integration of not just education, but how do we help them move in a different way too? So there's a lot of opportunities, and just thank you so much, and I hope that you have a great reflection.
Thank you again, Jaclyn, and I hope you're all energized for the rest of the day. If those who are leading reflection sessions, if you have not already left, if you could take a minute and excuse yourselves. There are 24 reflection sessions. We used up almost all of the alphabet, so lots of people are getting up. If I can have your attention for one more second, I've got 2 quick announcements. Just a happy announcement that our coats can stay in the room where we had breakfast all day. So you can leave your coats there and you'll be able to pick them up once you are heading over either to the Gardner or out. If anybody is standby, which is our wait list, please meet me back at the registration table and we'll see if we can squeak you in. Again, a reminder that the Scharf Visitor Center, Level 1, Shapiro Courtyard is where you can pick up a gallery stool. Again, Scharf Visitor Center, Level 1, Shapiro Courtyard. And if you are doing a lunch, again, you will meet at the entrance where you entered, at the Fenway entrance. All right, I think our folks have had enough of a lead time, so enjoy the rest of your day.